Hello everyone. Thank you for being here with me today. Before I begin my story, I would love to know which city you are joining us from. Please feel free to share in the comments. My name is Margaret, and this is the story of how my life, as I knew it, burned to the ground on my 50th birthday, and how I rose from the ashes. The scent of night-blooming jasmine has always been my favorite. It is supposed to be calming, a sweet perfume that hangs in the cool evening air. But tonight, sitting here on my porch swing, it just smells like poison. It is cloying, suffocating. Every gentle sway of the swing feels like a shove. And the rhythmic creak of the chains is like a clock ticking off the seconds of my new shattered reality. It has been 5 hours. 5 hours since I walked out of my own 50th birthday party, leaving behind the smiling faces of my friends, the half-eaten cake, and the smoking crater where my family used to be. My hands are still trembling. I am clutching a lukewarm mug of chamomile tea, but it might as well be gasoline for all the good it is doing. I keep seeing it, replaying the moment in my head like a car crash. I cannot look away from my husband, Richard, standing there with that charming smile he reserves for public appearances. My 3 sons, Thomas, William, and Henry, standing beside him, looking so proud. And all those faces, people I have known for 20 or 30 years, all turned towards me, their expressions shifting from happy anticipation to something else. Shock, pity, and in a few corners, a flicker of cruel amusement. This was supposed to be my night. A celebration of half a century. 50 years of trying to be a good person, a good wife, a good mother. I had spent weeks looking forward to it. I remember driving to the boutique downtown, spending hours going through racks of clothing until I found it. I bought a new dress, a lovely sapphire blue silk that made me feel well. It made me feel pretty for the first time in a long time. The fabric draped beautifully, and when I looked in the dressing room mirror, I saw the woman I used to be before the exhaustion of raising a family took over. I imagined toasts and laughter and maybe a slow dance with Richard. A moment to feel like we were still the young couple who promised each other forever. What a fool I was. What a blind sentimental fool. They called it a special presentation, a tribute. And I, like an idiot, smiled and felt a warmth spread through my chest. I thought it would be a slideshow of old photos, the boys on their first day of school, family vacations to the lake, clumsy Christmas portraits where someone was always blinking. I thought it would be sweet, maybe a little embarrassing, but full of love. Instead, they stood me in the center of the room and executed me publicly. They took a lifetime of my love, my sacrifice, my devotion, and they threw it back in my face like garbage. So now I sit here in the dark with the scent of jasmine choking me. The party is over. The guests have gone home whispering and gossiping about the spectacular implosion of our family. And I am left with the ringing silence and the single burning question that echoes in the wreckage. How did I not see this coming? How could I have been so blind? The house behind me is dark. It is no longer a home. It is just a building filled with ghosts and lies. And me. I am still here. And I am starting to realize that the heartbreak turning in my gut is slowly surely crystallizing into something else. Something hard and cold and sharp enough to cut. You know, when you are young and in love, you believe in fairy tales. My fairy tale started 25 years ago with Richard. We met at a local coffee shop. He was brilliant, ambitious, with a fire in his eyes that promised a life less ordinary. He would talk for hours about his visions for the future, waving his hands animatedly while I listened, completely captivated. I was just a girl with a significant inheritance from my parents who had passed away far too young. Their funeral had been a dark, lonely affair, and the money they left behind felt heavy, like a responsibility I did not know how to handle. I was not looking for someone to take care of me. I was looking for a partner, someone to build a life with. Richard sold me that dream and I bought it wholesale. He had a business idea, a tech startup that was, he claimed, going to change the world. All it needed was capital. My capital. I remember sitting at the kitchen table of my small apartment, reviewing the documents. I did not hesitate. I liquidated a huge portion of my trust fund, the money my father had worked his entire life to secure for me, and handed it over. It is for us, I told myself. It is for our future. And for a while it felt like it was. The business took off, not like a rocket, but it was successful enough. We bought this house in this lovely neighborhood. We spent our first weekend here sleeping on mattresses on the floor, eating takeout and dreaming about the rooms we would decorate. We had Thomas, our serious, handsome firstborn. I remember the sheer terror and joy of holding him in the hospital room. Then came William, the charming, easygoing middle child. And finally, Henry, our sweet, quiet baby. My life became them. I put my own career aspirations on hold to be a full-time mother. I had dreams once, an idea for a promotion at the design firm I worked for, but I folded those dreams up and tucked them away in a drawer. I managed the house, the school runs, the doctor appointments. I drove thousands of miles in that gray minivan, learning every shortcut in town. I hosted the holiday dinners, and planned the birthday parties. I spent days baking, decorating, making sure every balloon was perfectly placed. And I continued to be the family's silent financial partner. When Richard's business hit a rough patch, it was my money that bailed it out. When he wanted to expand, it was my signature on the loan documents, backed by my assets. I would sit in those sterile bank offices, smiling politely at the loan officers, signing away my security for his ambition. When Thomas wanted a brand new Mustang for his 16th birthday, Richard would say, "Let us see what we can do." But it was my account the money came from. I negotiated the price, I wired the funds, and Richard handed him the keys. When William got into some trouble with credit card debt in college, I was the one who quietly paid it off to keep it from affecting his future. I sat up late at night, transferring funds, making sure his credit score remained spotless. And when Henry needed tutors for his exams and a substantial college fund, it was my inheritance that made it possible. I set up the accounts, calculated the interest, ensured his education was secure. I never threw it in their faces. I never kept a tally. It was just what you did for family. I thought we were a team. Richard was the face of the family's success. The brilliant entrepreneur. I was the foundation, the quiet strength that held everything up. He got the accolades. He got the magazine features and the backslaps at the country club. I got the satisfaction of seeing my family thrive. Or so I told myself. Looking back now, the signs were all there, were they not? Little red flags I chose to ignore. The way Richard would dismiss my opinions on business matters with a pat on the hand, saying, "Do not you worry your pretty little head about it." The condescension dripping from his voice when he said it, making me feel like a child in my own home. The way the boys, as they got older, started coming to me for money, but going to their father for advice, as if I were just the bank teller and he were the bank president. They would ask me for a few hundred for a weekend trip and I would transfer it. Then I would overhear them on the phone with Richard laughing about some grand plan, some adventure that I was funding but was never a part of. There was a subtle shift in the household dynamic. It became Richard and the boys against the world, I guess, and I was just the support staff, the provider of comfort and cash. I cooked their favorite meals, washed their sports gear, folded their laundry, and handed over my credit cards. I convinced myself it was a natural part of sons growing up and bonding with their father. I told myself I should not be jealous, but a part of me felt erased. I was the architect of this beautiful life, yet I was becoming invisible within its walls. I furnished the gilded cage, polished the bars, and never once realized I was locking myself inside. Let me walk you through the party. I want you to see it exactly as I did. The event was held at a beautiful old country club, one we had been members of for years. I had spent months coordinating with the event planner, tasting menus, picking out floral arrangements. The main ballroom has these stunning floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook the golf course, and we had timed it so the sun would be setting right as the party got into full swing. It was perfect, or it was supposed to be. I spent the first hour greeting everyone. Old friends from college, neighbors we had known since the boys were in diapers. Richard's business associates. The room was buzzing with conversation and the clinking of expensive crystal. Everyone was so kind. "Margaret, you look stunning," they said. "50 looks good on you." I was floating, genuinely happy. I remember feeling a sense of deep accomplishment, looking around at the beautiful event I had orchestrated. Richard was by my side, one hand resting on the small of my back, playing the part of the proud, adoring husband. He handed me a glass of champagne and whispered to the most beautiful woman in the room. I actually blushed. I believed him. After about an hour and a half, just as dessert was being served, Richard tapped his glass for attention. The clinking sound cut through the ambient noise, and the room quieted down. My boys, Thomas, William, and Henry came to stand beside him at the front of the room near a large projector screen I had not paid much attention to. "Thank you all for coming," Richard began, his voice smooth as silk. 50 years. It is an incredible milestone, and no one deserves to be celebrated more than my wonderful wife, Margaret. He smiled at me, and I smiled back, my heart feeling so full it might burst. The boys and I wanted to do something a little different this year. Not just a gift, but a tribute. A look back at the woman who made all of our lives possible. My eyes started to well up. This was it. This was the moment of validation, of love that I had been subconsciously craving for years. All those lonely nights balancing checkbooks, all those early mornings packing lunches. It was finally being recognized. The lights dimmed and the projector flickered to life. The first few photos were exactly what I had expected. A picture of me and Richard on our wedding day. A photo of me holding a newborn Thomas, looking exhausted but blissful. A funny picture of the 5 of us on a ski trip covered in snow. People were chuckling, murmuring awe. I was leaning against the table, dabbing my eyes with a napkin, feeling completely surrounded by love. Then the tone shifted. The music changed from a soft piano melody to something jarring. A photo of me appeared on screen, a candid shot I had never seen before. I was in the kitchen looking stressed, flour on my cheek. I remember that day, I was trying to bake 3 separate pies for a school bake sale while managing the household bills. Richard's voice came over the speakers, a pre-recorded narration. "Margaret has always been practical," he said, and there was an edge to the word. She managed the household with an iron fist. The next slide was a spreadsheet. My household budget spreadsheet on a giant screen for all my friends to see. The meticulous rows and columns I used to ensure we never overspent. Every penny accounted for, Richard's voice continued. Sometimes a man needs room to breathe, to dream, but dreams do not fit neatly into a budget. My smile faltered. My stomach did a slow, sick flip. I looked around the room. A few people looked confused, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This was not a tribute. What was this? The slideshow continued. A picture of me looking tired in my gardening clothes was captioned. While I was building an empire, Margaret was content in her own little world. It was followed by a photo of Richard on a yacht with some business partners, laughing. The implication was clear. He was the ambitious one. I was the boring homebody holding him back. My cheeks were burning. I felt a hot flash crawl up my neck. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me. The air grew thick and uncomfortable. I looked at my sons, pleading with my eyes for them to stop this, but they just stood there stoic. Thomas, my firstborn, had a look of grim justification on his face. William, my charmer, would not meet my gaze. And Henry, my baby, just stared at his shoes. The final blow came when a photo of a stunningly beautiful woman, someone half my age, appeared on the screen. She had long blonde hair and a perfect, carefree smile. She was laughing, standing next to Richard on a sunny balcony somewhere tropical. Sometimes in life, Richard's voice said, now filled with a mock sadness. 2 people just grow apart. One person is ready to embrace the next chapter to live life to the fullest while the other is content to just manage the decline. He then walked back to the microphone in real time. He looked directly at me, his eyes cold. "Margaret, I wanted to do this in front of everyone so there would be no misunderstandings. I am in love with someone else. I am leaving you." The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. I stopped breathing. The floor felt like it was tilting beneath my feet. And then he said the words that would echo in my mind forever. "And I want to thank my sons for their support. They helped me realize I deserve to be happy." If Richard's announcement was a knife to the heart, what came next was the twisting of the blade by my own children. After he dropped that bombshell, a wave of gasps and whispers rippled through the room. I was frozen, my champagne glass still in my hand, unable to process what was happening. My fingers gripped the delicate stem of the glass so tightly I am surprised it did not shatter. It felt like a nightmare, a surreal play where I was the unwilling star. Then Thomas, my eldest, the one I had taught to read, the one whose nightmares I had soothed, stepped up to the microphone. He cleared his throat, looking not at me, but at the stunned audience. "We know this is a shock to everyone," he said, his voice steady. "But we have seen how unhappy our father has been for years. Mom, she is a good woman, but she is a lot. She is controlling. We just want our dad to have a chance at real happiness." Controlling. Was he talking about the time I insisted he finish his college applications instead of blowing his tuition money on a trip to Cancun? I remember sitting up with him until 2 in the morning, editing his essays, fighting his resistance every step of the way because I wanted him to have a future. Was he talking about me making sure he had a budget when he moved into his first apartment? An apartment I paid the security deposit for? My mind was reeling. Next was William. My charming, sociable William, who could always make me laugh. He looked deeply uncomfortable, but he took the mic anyway. "It is true," he mumbled, shuffling his feet. "Dad deserves this. We have been helping him, keeping his secret. We knew he was seeing someone else. We have even met her. She is great." He actually said that. He stood in front of me, in front of all our friends and family, and praised my husband's mistress. He talked about how she was fun and easygoing, and the unspoken contrast hung in the air like a guillotine. I was the difficult one. The ball and chain. I felt the blood drain from my face. They knew this was not a recent development. This was a long, calculated deception. They had watched me plan this party, watched me pick out my dress, watched me bubble with excitement, all the while knowing they were about to detonate a bomb in the middle of my life. I had sat at the dining room table with them just 3 days prior, showing them the floral centerpieces, and they had nodded and smiled. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it stole the air from my lungs. Henry, my youngest, never spoke. He just stood behind his brothers, a silent accomplice. But his silence was just as loud, just as damning. He was my baby, the one I was closest to, or so I thought. His refusal to look at me, his silent consent to this public execution was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. Richard put his arm around William and Thomas, a picture of father-son solidarity. "They even helped book our tickets for a trip to celebrate my new freedom," he announced with a triumphant grin. "So, I cannot be associated with their mother's negativity anymore." That is when it happened. A few people in the crowd, mostly Richard's younger business cronies, started to clap. A slow, hesitant clap that grew into scattered applause. Someone cheered. I saw a few people raise their glasses. They were toasting my demise. My humiliation was now a spectator sport. And my sons, my boys, were the architects of it. They had handed their father the matches and the gasoline and stood back to watch me burn. In that moment, something inside me did not just break. It vaporized. The soft, loving mother that had existed for 25 years ceased to be. And in her place, something cold and hard began to form. I do not remember driving home. I do not remember unlocking the front door or turning off the security alarm. I do not remember taking off that sapphire blue dress or washing the makeup off my face. I must have moved like a machine, purely on instinct. The next week is a blur of gray, a thick fog of shock and grief. I did not answer the phone, which rang incessantly for the first 2 days and then fell silent. I watched the caller ID flash with names of people who had stood in that ballroom and watched me get slaughtered. I did not check the dozens of texts that pinged, a meaningless chorus of fake concern. I just existed. My house, once a source of pride, felt like a mausoleum. I walked down the hallway, staring at the walls. Every framed photo on the wall was a lie. There we were, smiling on a beach in Hawaii, a trip I had paid for. I remembered researching the hotel, booking the flights, making sure everyone had the perfect vacation. There was Thomas's graduation photo, his cap and gown bought with my money. William's football trophy gleamed on the mantelpiece. I remembered every single Saturday I had spent on cold bleachers cheering for him. Wrapping myself in thick blankets, holding a thermos of coffee, screaming his name until my throat was sore. It was all a sham, a carefully constructed illusion of a happy family that I had funded and they had desecrated. For 3 days, I did nothing but drift from room to room. I would wander into the kitchen, open the refrigerator, stare at the shelves, and close it again. I tried to make coffee one morning and just stood there watching it overflow and run onto the counter, a dark, bitter puddle. I did not even grab a towel to wipe it up. I just watched it drip onto the floor. I sat in front of the television for hours, the screen flashing with images and sounds that never penetrated the fog in my head. Mindless daytime talk shows, infomercials for things I did not need. I did not eat. I barely slept. I was a ghost in my own life. Then on the 4th day, something shifted. I was sitting at the dining room table, staring at a dust bunny in the corner when the mail slot clattered. The sound was sharp, cutting through the heavy silence of the house. I did not move for an hour. But eventually, a flicker of something, not curiosity, but maybe just a vestige of old habit, made me get up. My legs felt stiff and heavy as I walked to the front door and picked up the small pile of envelopes from the floor. Bills, junk mail, and a crisp white envelope from my financial advisor. It was my quarterly portfolio statement. I sat back down at the table and opened it. The paper was thick and expensive. I stared at the numbers, the stocks, the bonds, the mutual funds, the assets listed under my name, the value of the properties tied to my inheritance. Pages and pages of financial security. It was a substantial amount. It was the foundation upon which this entire family had been built, and it was all mine. A thought, cold and clear as ice, cut through the fog. They thought they had all the power. Richard, with his mistress and his public declarations, my sons, with their smug pronouncements and their betrayal, they thought they had won. They thought they could humiliate me, discard me, and walk away with the life I had provided. They thought I would just retreat into the shadows, a sad, broken divorcee, leaving them to enjoy the fruits of my labor. They had forgotten one crucial detail. They had forgotten who held the purse strings. It was not a loud, angry epiphany. I did not scream or throw things. It was a quiet, deadly certainty that settled deep in my bones. The tears stopped. The fog lifted. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my chest, but it was now surrounded by a wall of ice. I stood up, walked to my office, and pulled out every financial document I could find. I opened filing cabinets that had not been thoroughly sorted in years. Bank statements, loan agreements, property deeds. My parents' will and trust documents. I carried armfuls of paper back to the dining room. I spread them all out on the dining room table, covering the polished wood with the architecture of my revenge. I organized them into neat piles. Assets. Liabilities. Joint accounts. Individual accounts. I did not need their love anymore. I did not need their respect. What I needed was a good lawyer. I spent the rest of the day on the phone, not with friends, but with the best divorce attorney and the most ruthless financial litigator I could find. I called law firms downtown, asking for the partners who handled high net worth, contentious separations. I was no longer a grieving wife and a heartbroken mother. I was a client, a CEO, and I was about to conduct the most hostile takeover of my own life. The planning had officially begun. To execute my strategy flawlessly, I needed them to believe I was completely broken. I needed them to underestimate me one last time. So, after a full week of total radio silence, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my phone. I watched the screen glow in the dim light of my bedroom. I took a deep, shuddering breath, practicing the exact tone I needed to project. I picked up the phone and dialed Richard's number. I let my voice tremble. I pitched it just high enough to sound fragile, as if I was perpetually on the verge of tears. I clutched a tissue in my free hand, almost convincing myself of the act. "Richard," I whispered into the receiver. There was a moment of genuine surprise on his end. I could hear the background noise of a busy space, maybe a restaurant or a crowded office lobby. Then, his voice came through, thick with false sympathy and unmistakable arrogance. "Margaret." I was beginning to worry. Worry. The audacity of that word was breathtaking. He had not called me a single time. He had not checked to see if I was even alive in this big, empty house. "I just do not understand," I said, injecting a pathetic little sob into my sentence. "I think we need to talk about the logistics. The divorce." I could almost hear the smug, triumphant smile spreading across his face through the cellular connection. "Of course, darling. I am very glad you are being sensible about this. There is absolutely no need for things to get ugly between us." "No," I agreed softly, wiping a completely dry eye. "Not ugly. I just want to make sure the boys are taken care of. That is all that really matters to me right now." That was the bait. The idea that my primary concern was still their well-being, that I was still the sacrificial, long-suffering mother willing to put herself last. He swallowed it whole. We agreed to meet for dinner in 2 days, along with the boys, at a quiet Italian restaurant we used to frequent on Sunday evenings. He suggested the location, thinking it was entirely his idea, a final family meeting to sort out the pathetic terms of my surrender. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I did not spend them crying or looking at old photo albums. I spent them strategically. I drove downtown to meet with my lawyer, a sharp, unsmiling woman named Sarah who specialized in high-asset, contentious separations. We sat in her pristine office, surrounded by walls of heavy legal volumes, and we drafted a series of highly specific documents. They looked like standard asset transfer forms full of dense legal jargon. One was a document that would permanently move Richard's name off our shared business accounts, completely under the guise of simplifying the divorce proceedings for tax purposes. Another was a form granting me sole, irrevocable power of attorney over the trust that funded the boys' allowances, their rent, and every other expense they incurred. To any casual observer, they were just boring administrative paperwork. But in the hands of my lawyer, they were loaded weapons. I also made sure my inheritance was completely legally walled off from any claims he might attempt to make. When I arrived at the restaurant on Thursday evening, I made sure I looked the absolute part of a defeated woman. I bypassed my usual elegant wardrobe and dug out a shapeless, faded gray cardigan I usually only wore when I was sick with the flu. I wore absolutely no makeup. I let my hair look flat and lifeless, pulling it back into a messy, uneven clasp at the nape of my neck. As I walked through the heavy wooden doors of the restaurant, the warm smell of roasting garlic and simmering tomatoes hit me. It was a smell deeply associated with years of happy family dinners and celebrations. I pushed that nostalgic memory down deep into my stomach and walked toward our table in the back corner. They were all there already, looking incredibly confident and relaxed. Richard was wearing a new, expensive-looking silver watch that caught the ambient light of the dining room. Thomas was scrolling through his phone, looking bored and completely detached from the situation. William gave me a tight, uncomfortable smile, raising his water glass in a half-hearted greeting. Henry just stared intently at the basket of warm bread, refusing to look up as I pulled out my chair. I slumped down in my chair and immediately avoided eye contact with all of them. I folded my hands tightly in my lap and let my shoulders droop forward. "Mom, you look really tired," Thomas said. It was not said unkindly, but with a clinical, observing detachment that chilled me to the bone. He was observing me like a specimen in a laboratory, calculating the exact emotional damage he had helped inflict. "It has been a very difficult week," I murmured, keeping my eyes fixed securely on the white linen tablecloth. The dinner was excruciating to sit through. They talked completely around the massive elephant in the room, making casual small talk about their daily lives. They discussed a new sports car William was thinking of buying, Henry's travel plans for the upcoming summer break, and Thomas complaining about a colleague who got a promotion he felt he deserved. They were acting as if this was all perfectly normal. They acted as if they had not just publicly vivisected me a week earlier in front of everyone I knew. Richard ordered an expensive bottle of imported red wine and poured generous glasses for himself and the 3 boys. He did not even offer me a glass. I played along perfectly, ordering a simple house salad, pushing the lettuce leaves around my plate with my fork, offering weak, fragile smiles, and saying very little. I was the silent ghost sitting at their celebratory feast. Finally, over coffee and rich tiramisu, Richard cleared his throat. He adjusted his expensive French cuffs and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table in a posture of authority. "Margaret, about the legal arrangements. My lawyer will obviously be in touch with yours next week, but I want this transition to be amicable. For the boys' sake, of course." I nodded slowly, looking down at my trembling hands. "Of course. All I care about is them. Which is exactly why my lawyer drew these up yesterday." I reached into my oversized, worn tote bag and pushed a slim manila folder across the table. It slid smoothly over the white linen and stopped right in front of Richard's coffee cup. "She said it would be much simpler if we untangled some of our shared finances right now," I explained, keeping my voice low, breathless, and hesitant. "It just gives me sole administrative authority over my own inheritance and the specific trust accounts. It makes the accounting cleaner so I can ensure the boys' funds are always protected and managed by me directly without bothering you. It is the only thing I have left to give them." My voice cracked perfectly at the end of the sentence. It was a masterful, calculated touch. I looked up at Richard with wide, defeated, tear-filled eyes. Richard, playing the picture of grand magnanimity, barely glanced at the dense legal papers. He saw my flawless performance of the broken woman, the devoted, self-sacrificing mother, and his massive ego did the rest of the heavy lifting. He assumed I was simply solidifying my permanent role as the family piggy bank, ensuring the cash would keep flowing smoothly to his sons even after he was gone and living with his new mistress. "Of course, Margaret. Whatever you think is best for the accounting," he said soothingly, pulling a sleek silver pen from his breast pocket. He flipped rapidly through the pages, not reading a single paragraph of the dense legal text, and signed his name on each page with a dramatic flourish. Then, he pushed the folder toward the boys. "You all need to sign these as well, as the listed beneficiaries of the trust. It is just acknowledging the change in daily management. Signed by the sticky notes." Thomas took the pen, signed his name on the designated lines without a second thought, and passed it to William. William followed suit, adding his signature quickly, clearly eager to get the uncomfortable administrative task over with so he could order another drink. Henry hesitated for a long moment. His eyes flickered toward me, holding a trace of something that looked remarkably like guilt or apprehension. But after a sharp, impatient, reprimanding look from Richard, he quickly scribbled his name on the final line. They handed the folder back to me. It felt incredibly heavy in my hands. It was heavy with the weight of their blind arrogance and my impending victory. I tucked it safely back into my bag, zipping it shut. I waited for the waiter to bring the check, and in a final, deeply ironic gesture, I placed my platinum credit card on the leather tray. I paid for the very dinner that sealed their absolute financial ruin, stood up, and walked out of that restaurant without looking back. The performance was officially over. The war was about to begin. The morning after that dinner, I woke up long before the sun. The sky outside my bedroom window was a deep, inky purple, just beginning to bleed into a pale gray. There was no lingering grief in my chest. There was no mental fog. There was only a cold, crystal-clear sense of purpose. I walked into the kitchen, the hardwood floor cold beneath my bare feet. I made myself a strong, steaming cup of black coffee, actively enjoying the bitter, sharp taste on my tongue. I sat down at my home office desk, opened my laptop, and watched the digital clock in the corner of the screen. I waited patiently for the clock to strike exactly 8 in the morning. It was time to pull the plug. My very first call was to the exclusive private bank that managed our primary wealth accounts. I dialed the direct line for our longtime account manager, a man named David Harris. I listened to the smooth jazz hold music for exactly 30 seconds before he picked up. "Good morning, Margaret," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "What can I do for you today?" "Good morning, David," I said. My voice was crisp, highly professional, and entirely devoid of the fragility I had displayed the night before. "I have a series of immediate financial directives. I have just emailed you the legal documents signed by Richard and my 3 sons last night, along with a formal letter of instruction drafted by my attorney." I heard the rapid clicking of his computer keyboard through the phone. "Okay, yes, I see the secure email coming through right now. Let me just open the attachments. First," I continued, speaking clearly and deliberately, "I need you to freeze all shared checking and savings accounts immediately. I am withdrawing all my personal assets from those joint accounts and moving them directly into my sole name. Second, I am officially revoking all supplementary credit cards linked to my primary accounts. The ones currently under the names Thomas Miller, William Miller, and Henry Miller. Revoke them. Effective immediately. Block any pending transactions they might try to make today." There was a stunned, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing heavily. "Margaret, is everything all right? This is highly unusual. These accounts are quite active." "Everything is perfectly fine, David. I am simply restructuring my entire financial portfolio. The documents you are looking at are legally binding. They grant me complete, unilateral authority over the trusts and the shared assets. Please confirm when the directives have been successfully executed." He stammered for a moment, his smooth professional veneer slipping completely as he realized the massive magnitude of what I was instructing him to do. Well, yes. The paperwork is legally sound. I will get my team right on it, Margaret. Thank you, David. I expect an email confirmation by noon." I hung up the phone. One by one, I made the rest of the calls. I called the trust fund manager and permanently suspended the automatic monthly transfers that served as my son's incredibly generous living allowances. I called the credit card companies and canceled the premium travel cards they used to fund their luxurious vacations and expensive bar tabs. Finally, I called the bank that held the automotive loan for Thomas's prized Mustang, a loan for which I was the primary financial guarantor. I informed the loan officer that I would no longer be responsible for the monthly payments under any circumstances and requested they initiate standard collection and repossession procedures on the primary driver. Let him figure it out. By 9 in the morning, the massive financial life support system that had comfortably sustained my husband and my sons for their entire lives had been completely switched off. I closed my laptop, leaned back in my leather desk chair, and took a deep breath of the quiet morning air. I felt a grim, undeniable sense of satisfaction. It was exactly like pruning a massive, dead, rotting branch from a beautiful tree. It was a painful, heavy cut, but absolutely necessary for the survival of the healthy roots. I did not have to wait long for the fallout to begin. Around noon, my cell phone vibrated violently on the kitchen counter. It was a text message from Thomas. "Mom, my card just got declined at the gas station." It was so embarrassing. The attendant looked at me like I was a criminal. "Is something wrong with the main account?" I looked at the text message. I read the words slowly. I imagined him standing out there at the pump, holding the fuel nozzle, slowly realizing the plastic in his designer wallet was suddenly completely useless. I did not respond. I simply locked the screen and set the phone face down. An hour later, another text arrived, this one riddled with typos indicating his rapidly growing panic. Seriously, Mom, what is going on? I tried calling the bank customer service line and they said the card was permanently cancelled. The representative would not tell me anything else. Call me back right now. Silence. I put the phone on silent mode and walked out into the backyard. Then came William, always the more dramatic brother, heavily reliant on his wealthy social image. He did not text. He called. The screen flashed his face, a happy picture I had taken of him smiling on a sailboat last summer. I let it ring. I watched the green circle pulse on the screen until it finally went to voicemail. 10 minutes later, I listened to the audio message. His voice was absolutely frantic, echoing slightly as if he was pacing back and forth in a public restroom. Mom, what the hell is going on? I just tried to pay for lunch with my important clients and the platinum card was completely declined. I was completely humiliated in front of him. I had to ask one of my junior associates to cover the bill. My cards are all declined. I checked my mobile bank app, the one you put my monthly allowance in, and it is totally empty. It says access denied. There is nothing there. This has to be some kind of massive computer mistake. Call me back immediately. The sheer, unfiltered panic in his voice, the sudden, terrifying realization that the endless well of money had finally run completely dry, was a brilliant symphony to my ears. I deleted the voicemail with a single tap. Later that afternoon, I sat down at the kitchen island with a cup of herbal tea to check my personal email. A formal message from Henry's University bursar's office popped into my inbox. It was a courtesy copy of a severe notice sent directly to his student portal regarding his college fund. Payment for the upcoming academic semester is past due, the automated email read. The automatic withdrawal from the primary funding account has failed due to insufficient access. Please remit full payment immediately to avoid complete suspension of your student privileges, cancellation of your course registration, and immediate eviction from university housing. I read the email twice to make sure I understood the severity. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread pleasantly through my chest. Then, I clicked the small trash can icon and moved the email permanently to the deleted folder. The storm had officially made landfall. They were so incredibly used to living in a world completely cushioned and protected by my money that they had absolutely no idea how to function as adults without it. They thought they had cleverly discarded me, viewing me as an annoying, controlling woman who was past her prime. But they were about to find out the hard way that they had only discarded their own safety net. I went out into my garden, knelt down in the soft dirt, and spent the entire afternoon peacefully pulling weeds. I felt the warm sun on my back, the rough texture of the soil on my bare hands, for the first time in what felt like an absolute eternity. For every stubborn weed I pulled from the earth, I felt like I was pulling another piece of their toxic poison out of my life. The days that followed were a rapid cascade of pure chaos, and I had a front row seat to the glorious destruction. My phone became a digital repository of their escalating panic. After their initial confusion turned into burning anger, their messages became a toxic cocktail of loud threats, wild accusations, and most pathetically, bewildered pleading. Thomas, my pragmatic, serious son who valued status above all else, was the first to truly unravel. He had built his entire public identity around being highly successful, wealthy, and in absolute control. It was an image entirely propped up by a luxury downtown apartment he could not afford on his own salary, and a high-end sports car he was not actually paying for. I received a frantic voicemail from him 3 days after I had cut him off. "Mom, the bank called," he shouted into the phone, his voice cracking. "They said the auto pay bounced and the account is closed. They are going to repossess the Mustang." "The Mustang? My name is on that loan." This is going to completely destroy my credit score. What are you doing? Are you actively trying to ruin my life? After everything Dad and I have done to try and secure our futures, you pull this childish stunt. You are being incredibly selfish. I listened to the message and slowly shook my head. All I could think was, my signature is on that loan as the primary guarantor, son. Your credit score is the absolute least of my worries right now. I knew that legally the bank would eventually come after me for the remaining balance, which is exactly why my lawyer had already prepared a settlement offer to pay off the car entirely in cash, take legal possession of it, and have the title transferred solely to my name. I had always liked the sleek lines of that car. It would look fantastic parked in my driveway. William's rapid downfall was less about tangible assets and much more about his luxurious lifestyle. He was a notorious social butterfly, constantly out with friends at expensive bars and high-end restaurants, always proudly picking up the heavy tab to look generous and successful. His desperation was palpable in a long string of increasingly unhinged texts that arrived at all hours of the night. They are going to evict me, Mom. The rent is due on the 1st and I have absolutely nothing. How am I supposed to pay it? I had to borrow money from a friend just to buy basic groceries. Do you know how humiliating that is for me? You are doing this out of pure, bitter spite. Dad was completely right about you. You are a bitter, vengeful woman. And then there was Richard. He tried his best to maintain his cool, detached, superior facade for about 48 hours. He must have assumed the declined credit cards and frozen trust accounts were a temporary glitch, a brief fit of pique from his hysterical, soon-to-be ex-wife that would resolve itself once she calmed down and realized her place. He was in for a remarkably rude awakening. Richard was in the middle of closing a massive new business deal, a venture that required him to put up a significant amount of capital up front to prove his liquidity. It was capital he blindly assumed he could easily pull from our shared investment accounts, just as he had done dozens of times over the last 2 decades. I heard about exactly what happened from a mutual acquaintance, a woman named Barbara who happened to be working in the exact same office building when the meeting took place. Apparently, Richard had strutted into the glass conference room in his tailored Italian suit, completely assuring his new business partners that the funds were fully secured and ready to transfer immediately. When he opened his sleek laptop to initiate the wire transfer and was met with a wall of red flags, locked screens, and frozen accounts, Barbara said all the color completely drained from his face. He made a flustered, sweaty excuse about a banking error and spent 20 humiliating minutes pacing in the hallway outside, yelling on his cell phone with the bank representative, getting the absolute worst financial news of his life. The deal, of course, fell through immediately. The partners packed their briefcases and walked out. He lost a massive financial opportunity, but far more importantly to a severe narcissist like Richard, he lost face in the local business community. His carefully crafted reputation as a wealthy, powerful player was completely shattered in a single afternoon. His text message to me later that evening was a single, furious line. "What the hell have you done?" I sat on my comfortable sofa, looked at the message glowing on the screen, and typed out my response slowly. I responded with a single word. Justice. The final and perhaps most satisfying piece of legal news came via a certified letter from my lawyer later that week. Richard, in his boundless arrogance, had actually tried to contact the county clerk's office to have me legally removed from the property deed of our home. He filed paperwork claiming I had willingly vacated the premises and officially abandoned the marriage. The formal notification stated that his request had been unequivocally denied by a judge. My lawyer had already filed the necessary injunctions, proving with extensive financial documentation that the property was purchased entirely and primarily with funds from a private trust established in my name long before our marriage even occurred. The house was not marital property subject to division. It was not ours. It was, and had always been, legally and unequivocally mine. I did not have to fight over custody of any minor children, but I was certainly keeping full custody of my home. My lawyer did not stop there. Because the house belonged solely to me, and because Richard had publicly announced his intention to leave the marriage for another woman, my lawyer had already drafted and officially served him with a formal eviction notice. He had exactly 30 days to pack his personal belongings and vacate my property. The king, who had so proudly stood on that stage and announced his exciting new freedom to the world, was about to become completely homeless. His kingdom was crumbling into dust around him, and he was finally beginning to realize he was just a jester in a court he never truly owned. A week after the total financial blackout, they finally showed up. All 4 of them together. It was a late Tuesday afternoon. The weather was absolutely beautiful, the kind of crisp, clear day that makes you want to open all the windows and let the fresh air in. I was in the kitchen, listening to an old jazz record on the vintage turntable I had just bought for myself. I was chopping fresh basil and garlic, trying out a complicated new recipe for lemon ricotta pasta when the doorbell rang. It was not a polite, friendly ring. It was a long, aggressive, insistent lean on the button. It buzzed through the quiet house like an angry hornet. I knew exactly who it was. I did not panic. My heart rate did not even speed up. I carefully set down my sharp chef's knife on the cutting board. I wiped my hands slowly on my linen apron, walked over to the stereo, turned down the music, and took a deep, steadying breath. When I opened the heavy wooden front door, they were standing on my porch like a delegation of the damned. Richard was standing in the front, his face a thunderous mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly disheveled. Behind him stood my 3 sons, a motley crew of exhaustion, anger, and desperation. Thomas looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and a wrinkled shirt. William was pale, fidgeting nervously with his watch strap. And Henry. Henry just looked completely lost, his eyes wide and haunted, staring intently at the wooden porch floorboards. "We need to talk," Richard bit out aggressively, stepping forward and trying to physically push past me into the foyer of the house. I did not move an inch. I planted my feet firmly on the threshold, crossing my arms defensively over my chest. I stood firm in the doorway, forming a physical barrier they could no longer cross. "No," I said, my voice calm, flat, and completely devoid of emotion. "We do not need to do anything. But if you want to talk to me, you can do it right out here on my porch." His eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "Do not be ridiculous, Margaret. Let us in right now. We are your family. This is my house, Richard. You are no longer welcome in it. You have about 3 weeks left on your eviction notice before you will be legally trespassing if you even set a foot on the front lawn. Now, what exactly do you want?" Thomas pushed his way forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with his angry father. "Mom, this has gone far enough. You are actively destroying our lives. My car is gone. The bank literally came with a tow truck this morning while I was at work. My credit is completely ruined. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking," I said, my voice dangerously calm, the words precise and measured, "about my 50th birthday party. I was thinking about how my eldest son stood up in front of a room full of our friends and called his mother controlling, all while he was driving a $50,000 car that I was paying for every single month." William jumped in, his voice cracking with anxiety. "But to cut us off completely without any warning? Henry might get kicked out of college next week. They sent him a formal eviction notice for his dorm. Is that what you want, Mom? To completely ruin his future?" I shifted my cold gaze to William, feeling a sudden surge of profound disgust. "What I want, William, is for my middle son not to stand up on a stage and publicly praise my husband's mistress. As for Henry's college fund, that was money directly from my parents' inheritance. It was intended to provide him with an incredible educational opportunity that he clearly does not appreciate or respect. He is a grown adult now. He can get a job, work minimum wage, and apply for student loans, just like millions of other kids do every single day." I looked directly at Henry, who physically flinched under my cold gaze. He opened his mouth, his lips trembling slightly as if to say something, but no words came out. He just swallowed hard and looked away, staring back down at his shoes. Richard finally lost the very last shred of his composure. He took an aggressive step towards me, his face turning an ugly shade of purple, his index finger jabbing the air inches from my face. "You vindictive witch. This is all about the money, is it not? You were always obsessed with your money. You were just trying to buy our obedience and punish us." I looked at his pointing finger, then up to his angry, pathetic face. And then, I laughed. It was not a hysterical, crazy laugh. It was a real, genuine, deep laugh that bubbled up from the bottom of my chest. The sound of it seemed to shock them into absolute silence. They stared at me as if I had completely lost my mind. "Oh, Richard," I sighed, wiping a genuine tear of mirth from my eye. "You could not be more wrong. This was never about the money. Not once. It was about the absolute fact that you all used my money, my home, my time, my entire life to build your own comfortable, privileged little worlds. You took absolutely everything I gave you for granted. And then, when it suited you, you decided I was disposable. You thought you could just throw me away in front of an audience, humiliate me, and still keep all the financial perks." I stepped slightly forward, forcing Richard to take a physical step back down the porch stairs to maintain his balance. "You thought you were the absolute kings of this castle. But you made one fatal error." I looked each of them directly in the eye, moving my gaze slowly from Richard, to Thomas, to William, and finally resting on Henry. "You forgot who built the castle. You forgot who owned the damn land it stands on. This is not about money. It is about consequences. A concept none of you have ever had to face before in your entire sheltered lives. Well, class is in session." They were entirely speechless. They had come here expecting a massive fight. They had expected me to be crying, hysterical, pleading for them to love me again. They had expected to easily bully me into submission, to use my maternal guilt to turn the financial taps back on. They were entirely unprepared for this calm, cold, immovable woman standing in the doorway of the house they could no longer enter. They were not prepared for me. They stood on the porch, sputtering, a tangled mess of entitlement, anger, and utter disbelief. Richard started trying to formulate a loud threat about divorce lawyers, aggressively demanding half of the marital assets and monthly alimony. Thomas was talking over him, whining about family duty and how a mother should never abandon her children under any circumstances. William was muttering to himself about how unfair and insane this all was. It was a pathetic, desperate display. I leaned comfortably against the doorframe and just let them talk for a few minutes. I listened to their weak, repetitive arguments, watching them spin their wheels in the mud. I wanted them to completely exhaust themselves, to lay all their desperate, selfish cards on the table. When they finally wound down, panting slightly, a tense, heavy silence fell over the porch. It was broken only by the cheerful chirping of a cardinal in the old oak tree on my front lawn and the distant sound of a lawnmower. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. No one answered. They just glared at me with pure hatred. "Good," I said, nodding my head once. "Because there is one last piece of formal business we need to discuss while you are all conveniently gathered here." I turned my back on them, walked back into the foyer, and picked up a thick, heavy manila envelope resting on the hall console table. I walked back to the doorway, holding the envelope firmly in both hands. "You are right about one thing, Richard," I said, looking him dead in the eye, my voice echoing slightly off the brick exterior of the house. "This is entirely about the future. My future, and by extension, yours." I opened the metal clasp and pulled a thick sheaf of legal documents from the envelope. It was freshly printed, bound, and officially stamped with a notary seal. I spent a considerable amount of time with my lawyer this past week getting all my final affairs in order. It is always good to have a solid plan, do you not think? I have always believed in planning for the worst-case scenario. I held up the first page so they could clearly see the bold heading at the top. "This document," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute clarity in the quiet afternoon air, is my last will and testament. And I have made some permanent, legally binding changes. I looked directly at Richard, letting a cold, humorless smile touch my lips. Richard, as my soon-to-be ex-husband who publicly declared his infidelity and initiated a separation, you will, of course, be receiving absolutely nothing. Not a single dime from my accounts, not a photograph from an album, not a single piece of furniture from this house you are currently being evicted from. When I eventually have a funeral, you will not be invited. When I die, you will get nothing. His face went from flushed, angry red to a pasty, sickly white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I then turned my gaze to my sons. My 3 boys. The boys I had carried, nurtured, loved beyond measure, and protected from every hardship life offered. They were now staring at the legal papers in my hand as if they were a literal death sentence. And Thomas, William, and Henry, I said. And for the very first time during that entire confrontation, my voice visibly trembled. Not with weakness, not with tears, but with the sheer, vibrating, righteous power of my final decision. As you all stood by and enthusiastically supported your father in his deception and his public cruelty, as you publicly disowned me and my value in your lives on a microphone in front of our community, I had decided to honor your stated position. I took a deep breath, letting the words hang heavily in the air. Your names have been completely, legally, and irrevocably removed from this will. You are no longer my beneficiaries. You will inherit nothing. The silence that followed was the most profound, heavy silence I have ever experienced. It was not just quiet. It was the sound of a vacuum. It was the sound of 3 incredibly comfortable, luxurious futures evaporating into thin air right before their very eyes. The massive trust funds they expected to carry them through life, the valuable property they assumed would eventually be theirs, the endless financial safety net they had taken for granted since the day they were born. All of it, gone in a single signature. All of my assets, I concluded, lowering the papers, my voice dropping to a calm, deadly whisper. My entire inheritance, this house, my investment portfolios, my retirement accounts. Everything I own will be placed directly into a charitable trust upon my death. It will be legally bound to fund full educational scholarships and build safe housing shelters for women and children who have been emotionally and financially abandoned by their families. People who actually need, appreciate, and deserve a second chance in life. They stood there, dead still. It looked as if they had all been turned to stone. The color had drained from all 4 of their faces. Richard looked like he was physically going to be sick on my steps, his hands resting heavily on his knees as he bent forward slightly. Thomas's jaw was clenched so tight the veins in his neck were bulging, I genuinely thought his teeth might crack under the pressure. William was openly gaping, his mouth hanging slack in stunned, uncomprehending horror. And Henry. Tears were silently streaming down Henry's face, dripping off his chin onto his shirt collar. They finally understood. This was not a temporary punishment. This was not a harsh lesson designed to teach them morals and then welcome them back with open arms. This was a permanent, legal erasure. This was the end of the line. I stood there for a long moment, letting the pathetic image burn permanently into my mind. Richard, the great tycoon, the master of the universe, looking like a deflated, broken balloon. My sons, my boys who I had sacrificed my own identity for, looking at me as if I were a complete stranger, a monster who had just stolen their golden future. But I was not a monster. I was simply a woman who had finally, painfully, learned her own worth. After my announcement, there was absolutely no more yelling. There was no more arguing about lawyers or fairness or family duty. There was just a thick, dead air hanging over my front porch. It was as if I had sucked all the breathable oxygen out of their world. They just stared, their minds clearly struggling to process the massive, immovable reality I had just laid out for them. Finally, Richard found his voice, but it was not his usual booming baritone. It was just a hoarse, pathetic whisper. "You cannot do this, Margaret. It is not right." "I just did," I said softly, tapping the thick documents against my palm. The papers are filed with the state. The trusts are established. It is done. I looked at them one last time, a pathetic tableau of ruin clustered on my front steps, and I realized something incredible. I felt absolutely nothing. The burning anger was completely gone. The soul-crushing heartbreak had faded into a dull, distant ache that was easily ignored. All I felt was a profound, overwhelming sense of finality. A sense of deep, unshakable peace. "Now, if you will excuse me," I said, my voice perfectly even and polite. "I have lemon ricotta pasta simmering on the stove, and I do not want the sauce to break. I strongly suggest you leave my property before I call the police and have you formally removed for trespassing." And with that, I took a step back inside my foyer. I did not slam the door in their faces. I did not need a dramatic exit. I simply closed the heavy oak door gently, but very firmly. The loud, metallic click of the deadbolt sliding securely into place was the most satisfying, beautiful sound I have ever heard in my entire life. It was the sound of my old life ending. It was the sound of my new life finally beginning. I stood in the hallway and leaned forward, looking through the small glass peephole. I watched them. They did not move for a full minute, standing frozen like statues in a museum exhibit of regret. Then, the spell finally broke. Richard turned around, his face dark with fury, and said something sharp and aggressive to Thomas. Thomas immediately snapped back at him, throwing his hands up in defense. William ran his hands through his hair, threw his head back, and let out a visible groan of pure despair. They started arguing with each other. Their hushed, furious voices, violently blaming each other for the catastrophe, filtered faintly through the thick wood of the front door. I smiled. It was not my problem anymore. Their chaos, their debts, their complete lack of a future, it was all entirely their own burden to carry. I watched as they finally turned and trudged slowly down the brick walkway toward the street, a defeated, broken little army dragging their feet. As they reached the sidewalk where Richard's leased car was parked, Henry, my youngest, stopped. He turned back and looked up at the house. He looked directly at my front door, his face completely streaked with tears, looking incredibly young and incredibly lost. I saw his mouth move. He formed the word "Mom," but no sound reached me through the glass. He lingered there on the sidewalk for a long moment, a lost little boy realizing he had wandered too far into the dark woods, before his father barked his name aggressively from the street. Henry flinched, dropped his head, and hurried to join them in the car. I stayed by the door for a long time after the car drove away, resting my forehead against the cool, solid wood. I was not crying. My eyes were completely dry. I was just breathing. Deep, full breaths that filled my lungs completely. For the very first time in 25 years, I felt like I was breathing my own air, in my own house, in my own life. I walked back into the kitchen. The pasta on the stove had boiled over slightly, and the sauce had indeed broken, a clumpy mess in the pan. But it did not matter at all. I dumped it in the trash, washed the pan, and poured myself a glass of crisp white wine. I could always make more pasta. I could order a pizza. I could do whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. I was finally, terrifyingly, and completely free. The months that followed that final confrontation on the porch were incredibly quiet. At first, the sheer silence in the large house was almost deafening. I was so accustomed to the constant, chaotic noise of 3 boys growing into men, the booming sound of Richard pacing the halls on business calls, the unending hum of a large family always in motion. I would wake up in the morning and expect to hear the shower running down the hall, or the television blaring sports highlights in the living room. Now, there was just me. And the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I had to relearn how to be alone. I had to learn how to exist without constantly reacting to the needs, demands, and messes of 4 adult men. So, I started filling the silence. Not with meaningless noise, but with life. My life. The very first thing I did was book a first-class ticket to Italy. It was a trip I had dreamed of taking since I was in my 20s, but had always put off because Richard hated long flights and the boys always had summer sports camps. I spent a glorious month traveling entirely by myself. I wandered for hours through the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, staring at masterpieces without anyone rushing me to find a restaurant. I ate massive scoops of pistachio gelato while sitting on the stone steps in Rome, watching the tourists go by. I rented a small villa on the Amalfi Coast, spending my evenings sitting on the terrace overlooking the glittering sea, drinking local wine and reading entire books cover to cover. I did not have to consult anyone's rigid schedule. I did not have to worry about anyone's dietary preferences or complain about the heat. I just woke up every single day and did exactly what I wanted to do. It was the most liberating, intoxicating experience of my life. When I came back home, deeply tanned and completely refreshed, I decided it was time to resurrect those old dreams I had folded away in a drawer decades ago. I threw myself into a small business idea I had been playing with in my head for years, a boutique, high-end landscape design firm. I loved gardening. It was the one place in my marriage where I found absolute peace. I took that passion, used the extensive knowledge I had gained from cultivating my own massive property, and poured all my newly freed energy into it. I enrolled in advanced horticulture classes at the local community college. I got fully certified in sustainable landscape architecture. I registered an LLC, proudly calling it New Bloom Landscapes. I started very small, offering to redesign the flower beds for a few close friends and neighbors. I would wake up at dawn, put on my sturdy work boots, load up my SUV with flats of perennials and heavy bags of organic soil, and spend 8 hours a day with my hands buried deep in the dirt. It was exhausting, backbreaking physical labor, and I absolutely loved every single second of it. To my absolute surprise, the business took off faster than I could have ever anticipated. People truly loved my work. They loved my eye for color and texture, my dedication to native plants. Word of mouth spread rapidly through the affluent neighborhoods. Within 6 months, I had a waiting list of clients. I had to hire a small, dedicated crew of workers and buy a branded company truck. For the first time in my entire adult life, I was earning my own salary. I was building a tangible, thriving company that was entirely, completely mine. The salary I paid myself was not massive to start, but holding that first paycheck in my hands, a check earned through my own passion, sweat, and skill, felt vastly superior to any withdrawal I had ever made from my massive trust fund. It was the sweet, undeniable taste of genuine independence. As my business grew, my personal life blossomed alongside it. I actively reconnected with old friends. The wonderful women who had relentlessly called and texted me with genuine concern in the weeks after the disastrous birthday party, the friends I had completely shut out in my initial, suffocating grief. I called them, apologized for my absence, and invited them over. We started having long, lingering lunches at outdoor cafes. I joined a rigorous book club that actually read the books and debated them passionately. I started taking evening yoga classes, learning to stretch and breathe and center myself. My life became incredibly rich, vibrant, and full in a way it had never been when it was solely revolving around the orbit of 4 demanding men. Occasionally, of course, I would hear bits and pieces of news about my former family through the ever-active town grapevine. People loved to gossip, especially about the mighty falling from grace. A friend of a friend mentioned seeing Richard at a local diner, looking incredibly stressed, graying rapidly, and wearing a suit that looked a few years out of date. Apparently, his beautiful, young mistress, the one he had so proudly paraded on the projector screen, had been deeply in love with his extravagant lifestyle, not the man himself. The exact moment my accounts were permanently frozen and the humiliating eviction notice was served, she realized the gravy train had derailed. She packed her designer bags and vanished without a trace. Richard was completely broke, his reputation in the business community irreparably ruined. He was now living in a sad, beige apartment complex out by the loud interstate highway, desperately trying to find freelance consulting work to pay his basic bills. Another friend from my book club told me that Thomas had been forced to surrender the keys to his luxury apartment. He had moved into a small, dingy rental house in the far suburbs. The repossession on his credit report had severely impacted his career trajectory. He had lost his prestigious, high-paying job and was now working in a soul-crushing, mid-level management position for a logistics company he used to openly mock. His massive pride forced him to swallow his humiliation daily. William, the charming socialite who loved buying rounds of drinks, had quickly discovered that his famous charm was directly tied to the thickness of his wallet. When he could no longer pick up the tab or secure VIP tables, his fair-weather friends had drifted away to find a new sponsor. I heard he was currently working night shifts as a bartender at a local pub, a job that cruelly forced him to stand behind the counter and watch other people live the carefree life he once took for absolute granted. And Henry. The news about Henry was the only piece of gossip that gave me a sharp pang of something resembling true sadness. I heard Henry had formally dropped out of his university. Without the endless flow of cash from the college fund, he could not afford the exorbitant out-of-state tuition, and his pride, or perhaps his fear, kept him from taking out massive student loans. He had moved back to town, was working full-time stocking heavy shelves at a local hardware store, and was living in a cheap, tiny room he rented above a garage. He was so incredibly young to be struggling so hard. But whenever that familiar maternal ache flared up in my chest, I firmly reminded myself of the truth. These were the direct, unavoidable consequences of their own cruel choices. I had handed them every single advantage in the world on a silver platter, and they had gleefully thrown it all away for a moment of cruel, misguided loyalty to a man who deserved absolutely none of it. I was busy rebuilding a beautiful new world for myself, while they were left to navigate the dark, cold ruins of the world they had actively helped to destroy. About a year after what I now privately referred to as the Great Implosion, on a Tuesday afternoon that felt wonderfully, beautifully ordinary, a letter arrived in my mailbox. I had just come home from a highly successful client meeting. My cheeks were still flushed with the pure thrill of officially landing a massive contract to design and install the expansive rooftop garden for a brand new luxury hotel downtown. It was the biggest job my firm had ever secured. I was humming a jazz tune, feeling the satisfying, dull ache in my shoulders from a morning of hands-on planting at another site. My mind was buzzing with creative ideas about drought-resistant perennials, complex irrigation systems, and custom stone pathways. My life had found a beautiful new rhythm, a rhythm dictated entirely by the changing seasons, the quality of the soil, my client deadlines, and my own boundless creative energy. The traumatic chaos of the past felt like a distant, murky nightmare that belonged to a completely different woman. I tossed my keys on the counter and stood at the kitchen island, sorting through the daily mail. There were invoices for my thriving business, a thick glossy catalog for rare Dutch tulip bulbs, a postcard from a girlfriend vacationing in coastal Maine. And then, stuck between a utility bill and a flyer, I saw it. It was a single, plain white, inexpensive envelope. My name and address were written in a familiar, slightly messy, slanting script that immediately made my heart give a painful, sharp little squeeze against my ribs. It was from Henry. My first, visceral instinct was to grab the envelope, walk over to my home office, and drop it directly into the heavy-duty paper shredder. No questions asked. No lingering doubts. I had spent an entire year meticulously, painfully rebuilding the thick fortress around my new life, laying down boundary after boundary, brick by painful brick. My peace of mind was a new, precious, and somewhat fragile thing. This letter sitting on my pristine quartz countertop felt like a heavy stone lobbed forcefully over my protective wall, threatening to shatter the calm waters of my life. I left the letter sitting on the kitchen counter. For 3 entire days, it remained there, a silent, white rectangle of potential agony radiating energy into my kitchen. Every single time I walked past it to get a glass of water or make coffee, I felt a physical jolt of adrenaline. I was terrified to open it. I was afraid of what it might demand of me. I was afraid it would be a trick, a new, sophisticated form of emotional manipulation orchestrated by Richard, using Henry as the pawn. Finally, on a quiet, slow Sunday morning, I decided I could not let a piece of paper hold me hostage in my own home. I made a cup of strong French press coffee. I walked into my newly redecorated living room. It was filled with bright, cheerful colors, plush, comfortable furniture, and dozens of vibrant house plants. There was absolutely no trace of Richard's heavy, oppressive, dark wood taste remaining. The morning sun was streaming through the large windows, casting warm golden pools on the floor. I sat down in my favorite velvet armchair, feeling strong, grounded, and secure. I picked up the envelope, slid my finger under the flap, and tore it open. The letter inside was just a single page, written in blue ink on cheap, simple-lined notebook paper. The edges were slightly crinkled. "Dear Mom," it began. My breath hitched in my throat. I had to close my eyes for a second. He had not called me that in what felt like a lifetime. I took a sip of coffee and forced myself to keep reading. "I do not know if you will even read this, and I honestly would not blame you if you threw it straight into the garbage. I am writing this knowing you might hate me forever. I need to say right away that I am not writing to ask you for anything. I swear on my life. I do not want any money, and I am not asking you to change your mind about the will or the trust funds or anything else. You were completely right to do exactly what you did. We absolutely deserved it. I see that clearly now." I had to pause, lowering the paper to my lap. My eyes were blurring with unshed tears. I had heard apologies before in my life. The hollow, self-serving apologies that manipulate rather than heal. This felt entirely different. The tone was raw. I lifted the paper again. "I am writing because I needed to say to you, directly, that I am so incredibly sorry. What we did to you at your birthday party was the absolute worst, most cruel thing I have ever been a part of. It was monstrous. I see that now. I stood there on that stage and said absolutely nothing to defend you. I let them humiliate the woman who gave me everything. And that silence makes me just as guilty as Dad, Thomas, and William. I was a coward, plain and simple. I was so desperate for Dad's approval, so caught up in the stupid idea that he was the cool, successful one, that I actively helped him break his own wife, my own mother. There is no excuse for what I did. I will not even try to make one." A single tear escaped and tracked warmly down my cheek. I wiped it away quickly. This last year has been the absolute hardest year of my entire life, but it has also been the most real. I formally dropped out of school. I could not afford it, and I refused to ask for help. I am working 40 hours a week at a hardware store on Route 9. It is not a glamorous life at all. I spend my days assembling heavy patio grills, unloading delivery trucks, and sweeping floors. My back constantly aches. But Mom, it is the very first time in my life I have ever earned my own paycheck. It is the first time I have paid my own rent for a tiny, hot room above a garage. It is the first time I have ever actually had to be a responsible adult. He was working manual labor. My baby, who I had planned to send to graduate school, was assembling grills. And doing this, the letter continued, has made me realize what a spoiled, incredibly ungrateful, and fundamentally weak person I was. It has made me realize how hard you worked for us. I see everything you did for us now, everything you gave us so freely, the sacrifices you made that we just took for absolute granted, like the air we breathed. We treated you like an ATM and a maid, and I am so deeply ashamed." The handwriting became a little shakier, the ink pressed harder into the paper. "I want you to know that I do not talk to Dad or Thomas or William anymore. I cut them off months ago. I tried to talk to them about what we did to you, about feeling actual remorse and wanting to apologize. They just do not get it at all. They are still so incredibly angry at you. They actually think you are the villain of the story. They blame you for all their financial problems and their failures. They sit around complaining about how unfair you were. I cannot be around that toxic poison anymore. It makes me sick to listen to them." He had cut them off. He saw them for who they truly were. I know I do not deserve your forgiveness, Mom. I probably never will. That is a heavy consequence I have to live with for the rest of my life. I accept that. But I just desperately wanted you to know that one of us, at least, finally understands. One of us is truly, deeply, profoundly sorry for breaking your heart. I love you. Henry. I read the letter from top to bottom 3 times. Then, I read it a 4th time, tracing the blue ink of his signature with my index finger. The tears I genuinely thought I no longer had inside me were now streaming freely down my face, dripping steadily onto the cheap-lined paper, blurring the ink of his apology. But they were not tears of pure, devastating sadness. And they were not tears of fresh, burning anger. They were tears of a deep, incredibly complicated grief, but heavily mingled with a bright flicker of something else. Something warm. It was the very first crack in the massive wall of solid ice I had so carefully, meticulously constructed around my heart over the past 12 months. It was a single, fragile note of genuine, heartfelt remorse playing over a deafening symphony of selfish, arrogant noise. This letter was not a magical solution. It was not a fairy tale fix that instantly erased the trauma and made everything perfectly okay again. The betrayal was still real. The public humiliation still happened. But this letter was something incredibly valuable. It was an acknowledgement. It was validation. And after an entire year of feeling like my immense pain and sacrifice had been completely invisible to the people I loved most, receiving that validation from my youngest son was a truly, undeniably powerful thing. So, now, here I am. I am right back where I started telling you this story, sitting out here on my sturdy wooden porch swing. But absolutely everything in my world is different now. This swing, which was once a vessel for my overwhelming, suffocating grief on that dark night a year ago, is now my absolute favorite spot in the world to have my morning coffee and watch the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air out here is cool, crisp, and clean. And the new jasmine bushes I specifically planted by the steps to replace the old, memory-laden ones? They smell incredibly sweet and full of new beginnings. My life is entirely my own now, and let me tell you, it is a remarkably good life. It is a life built with my own 2 hands, watered with my own tears, and sustained by my own strength. My landscape design business, New Bloom Landscapes, is infinitely more successful than I ever dared to dream when I was taking those evening classes. I have a 6-month waiting list of high-end clients begging for my services. I have a small, incredibly dedicated, and hard-working crew who respects me as their boss. Just last week, I stood on the windy rooftop of that massive new hotel downtown. I looked out over the finished garden, my complex design, my hard work, my vision brought to life, with the glittering city skyline stretching out endlessly before me. And in that moment, the wind whipping my hair, I felt a sense of fierce, undeniable pride that was so profound, so purely and exclusively mine, that it brought happy, stinging tears to my eyes. The thick paychecks I personally deposit in the bank every 2 weeks, the ones carrying my own business name printed boldly across the top, feel infinitely more valuable and satisfying than any dollar I ever inherited from a trust fund or received in a marriage. This is a success I have bled for. A success I have truly earned. My house has been completely transformed from the inside out. It is no longer a dark, silent monument to a failed, deceitful marriage. The heavy, oppressive darkwood furniture Richard insisted on keeping is completely gone, sold to an antique dealer or donated to charity. It has all been replaced with light, airy, comfortable pieces I picked out myself, reflecting my own taste. The walls, once painted in drab, serious tones, are now covered in warm, cheerful, vibrant colors that catch the afternoon sun. And the photographs. The photographs lining the walls have all been completely changed. The long gallery wall in the main hallway no longer shows the stiff, forced smiles of a family living a lie. Now, it holds large, candid pictures of me and my wonderful girlfriends laughing until we cry on a weekend trip to Santa Fe. It holds a beautiful, messy picture of my landscaping crew and me, absolutely covered in dark soil, grinning ear to ear after finishing a grueling, massive project in the summer heat. It holds a stunning, panoramic photo I took myself of the fiery sunset dipping below the horizon over the Amalfi Coast during my solo trip to Italy. It is a wall dedicated entirely to my new life. My chosen family. My genuine joy. My friendships are the solid bedrock of this beautiful new life. Women I had foolishly neglected in the thick, demanding haze of my endless family obligations have rallied around me like an army of fierce protectors. We have long, boisterous wine nights sitting out in the beautiful garden I have meticulously cultivated. We take spontaneous road trips together. We fiercely support each other's business ventures and personal growth. They have seen me at my absolute, sobbing worst, lying on the floor in a gray cardigan, and they have joyously celebrated my vibrant rebirth. They are the loyal sisters I never had growing up, and their unconditional love is a constant, steadying presence in my world. And then, of course, there is Henry's letter. It currently sits exactly where I left it, inside a small, beautiful wooden box on my office desk. I still have not written an answer to it. I have not answered it not because I am still boiling with anger. I am truly not angry anymore, the fire burned itself out months ago. I have not answered it because the monumental question of what exactly to do next is so incredibly, deeply complex. For a few days after reading his raw apology, I found myself constantly drafting potential replies in my head while I was driving or pulling weeds. One mental draft was cold, formal, and distant, politely acknowledging his apology but firmly offering absolutely nothing more, keeping the heavy iron gate securely closed. Another draft was warm, forgiving, and maternal, opening the door just a tiny crack to let him peek back in. I even went so far one evening as to pull out a piece of my absolute best, most expensive stationery, the thick, creamy paper I only use for very special, important notes, and I picked up my favorite heavy fountain pen. I sat at my desk, uncapped the pen, and carefully wrote the date at the very top of the blank page. And then, I stopped. I put the pen down. Because what I suddenly realized in that quiet moment of hesitation was the most powerful, earth-shattering lesson I had learned over the entire grueling span of the last year. The ultimate victory was not in the dramatic act of cutting them all off financially. The victory was not in watching Richard lose his business deals or seeing Thomas lose his expensive car. The victory was not even in the massive financial success of my landscaping business or the beautiful new furniture in my living room. The true, lasting victory was in finally reclaiming my own personal agency. For 25 long years, my entire existence was a never-ending series of reactions. Reacting to the demands of my ambitious husband. Reacting to the financial needs of my growing sons. Reacting to the schedules, the crises, the expectations of everyone else around me while I slowly faded into the background wallpaper of my own home. Now, sitting at this desk, looking at that blank piece of thick paper, for the very first time in my adult life, I am not reacting to anyone. I am actively choosing. The weighty choice of whether or not to initiate contact with Henry is mine, and mine alone. It is not dictated by the crushing, suffocating guilt of a mother who feels she must always sacrifice. It is not dictated by a sense of family obligation or societal pressure to forgive and forget. It is certainly not dictated by the weak ghost of the subservient woman I used to be. If I choose to write back, it will be a conscious choice made entirely by the strong woman I am right now. A woman who is fiercely independent, deeply successful, and fiercely, unapologetically protective of her own hard-won peace of mind. The mother deep inside me absolutely aches for the lost, struggling boy who wrote that desperate letter from a hot room above a garage. But the survivor in me, the woman who dragged herself out of the smoking crater of a 50-year-old life, knows with absolute certainty that my own mental and emotional well-being must come first. Always. No exceptions. I look out over the railing of my porch at my garden. The climbing roses I planted last spring along the trellis are in full, glorious, vibrant bloom. The deep red petals look like velvet in the morning light. They are incredibly strong, resilient plants. They survived the bitter, freezing winter frost that killed off weaker shrubs, and they fought off the aggressive summer beetles, and they came back this season more beautiful, more vibrant than they ever were before. But they still need intense care to survive. They need careful, strategic pruning to cut away the dead wood so new growth can happen. They need to be fiercely protected from blight and disease. My newfound peace is exactly like that rose garden. It is beautiful. It is thriving. It brings me immense joy every single day. But it requires my constant, unwavering vigilance to maintain. I cannot let weeds choke the roots. My old life is a story that has already been told, published, and put on the shelf. My old family dynamic is a dark chapter that has been permanently closed and sealed shut. But my future? My future is a vast, beautiful, completely unwritten landscape stretching out before me. And for the very first time in my life, I am the only person holding the map. I am the only person holding the pen. I am the one who gets to decide exactly where the winding path goes next. I get to decide what new seeds to plant in the soil, and I get to decide how high to build the protective walls around my heart. And let me tell you, that feeling? That complete ownership of self? That is a power far greater and vastly more valuable than any bank account, any marriage certificate, or any inheritance could ever offer. That is the ultimate, intoxicating freedom. Thank you so much for sitting with me today and listening to my story. I know it was a long one, but it is a journey I needed to share. If you have ever found yourself in a place where you had to completely rebuild your own life from the ashes of betrayal, or if any single part of my journey to finding independence and agency resonated with you, please, take a moment to share your thoughts and your own experiences in the comments section down below. Reading your stories is a powerful, beautiful reminder that absolutely none of us are ever truly alone in these difficult battles we fight behind closed doors. We draw strength from each other's victories. And please, if you found value in this video, do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Because every single one of us has a story of survival and resilience that is absolutely worth telling. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one.